Welcome to the fourth episode of our podcast, Study Sessions, with me, Mr. Boff. In today's episode, we're going to be thinking about the role of supernatural elements in the play and how these supernatural elements interact with and reinforce many of Macbeth's key themes and ideas. With that in mind, the best place to start is, of course, at the beginning. So the play opens, Macbeth opens with the witches. They're the first characters that we actually engage with, that we see on stage. Unlike many of his other plays, Shakespeare starts this play in a very intense and unsettling way. What an arresting opening it is to start with the witches, and rather than having, for example, two characters just communicating with each other. It's easy to imagine, of course, how such an opening would actually grab the attention of theatregoers in Shakespeare's day and continues to grab attention even today in 2024. So we're thrown in this opening into a really unsettling, strange moment in which these three weird sisters are plotting to meet with a character called Macbeth. Remember, at this point of the play, we haven't seen Macbeth, we've not come across him yet, so we won't actually meet him on stage until Act 1, Scene 3. Also remember that the language of the witches is very strange, it's odd, it has this incantatory effect, it feels like some sort of verbal spell. And this very famous opening of the play, establishes a key idea, one of the real preoccupations of Macbeth, which is the idea around ambiguity and the fact that boundaries between different ideas and different meanings are perhaps not as secure as we might like to imagine. And this is nowhere more apparent than in the famous line, "Fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air." So in that line, "Fair is foul, foul is," these chanted lines, of course, very important that they chant these lines together, something we'll come to in a moment. There is a sense in which fair is foul, one thing can very quickly turn into its opposite. And that sense of ambiguity, of equivocation, which we'll come to later, of things slipping between different boundaries, for some characters, that's a source of real fear and concern. But also other characters, Lady Macbeth notably, the witches to a certain degree, I suppose, even Macbeth himself, seem rather more at times comfortable with those ambiguities, and in fact see within those ambiguities the possibility for deception and indeed duplicity. Just to come back to the fact that these lines are chanted, the fact that it's all three witches in unison chanting "fair is foul, foul is fair," the fact that they're not spoken by individuals, again, is a reminder that individual boundaries are being blurred, they're somehow unstable. Is this one entity speaking? Are the witches three and one somehow simultaneously? And it is, again, that instability, that ambiguity that's key, and it's a really unsettling element of the supernatural within the play. Now we come to the first line that Macbeth says in the entire play. He says this, he says, "So foul and fair a day I have not seen." Now, there are a couple of interpretations that are available there. This is from Act 1, Scene 3. So he walks on stage and he says, "So foul and fair a day I have not seen." And we already know that language from Act 1, Scene 1. The witches have already said, "Fair is foul and foul is fair." So there is that immediate linguistic echo going on. Different interpretations. One interpretation would be that the fact that Macbeth is using the language of the witches, albeit perhaps unwittingly, okay, he doesn't sort of know that he's doing it, is maybe a sense of, or gives us a sense of, the witches' supernatural power, that even on some kind of linguistic language level, the witches are controlling and manipulating Macbeth. But I prefer a slightly different reading to it, and I would say both are equally valid. But my reading of when Macbeth says, "So foul and fair a day I have not seen," is it reveals something I think quite profound about Macbeth, which is perhaps reading it as an indication that his mind is ready and willing and receptive to the notion or idea of ambiguity, that he is already open to the possibility of a day, in this case, being both foul and fair simultaneously. So there's already that duality, that doubleness, and that kind of equivocation within Macbeth. He seems sort of receptive to it, even on this language or linguistic level. We can contrast that, curiously, interestingly, with Banquo's response to the weird sisters, which really does draw a quite stark difference between Banquo and Macbeth. So Banquo says, when he sees the witches for the first time, "What are these, so withered and so wild in their attire, that look not like the inhabitants of the earth, and yet are on? Live you, or are you aught that man may question? You seem to understand me, by each at once her choppy finger laying upon her skinny lips. And then the crucial line, you should be women, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so. So if we just sort of unpick some of the questions, some of the doubt here, what are these? You seem, you should be. This is the language of doubt, of uncertainty. And unlike is the case is for Macbeth, unlike with Macbeth, Banquo says the following. He says, your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so. This uncertainty for Banquo seems somewhat forbidding, that he is reluctant to interpret them in particular ways. And therefore, there is a sense with Banquo that the supernatural ambiguity of the witches, the fact that they are slippery in terms of their identity, in terms of their gender identity. You look like women and yet you've got beards. Are you part of the earth? Are you inhabitants of the earth or are you not? Are you able to speak? Are you able to communicate? Can I actually question you? These ambiguities for Banquo are something that we should be concerned about. These are signs of evil, fundamentally. Macbeth, on the other hand, goes straight in with, speak if you can, what are you? He wants to hear what they have to say. He's very willing from the off in this line to accept the paradoxical kind of ambiguities of the witches. Speak. He just wants to hear what they have to say. Now, this brings me on to a really interesting reading of the witches. This is something to just think about, and it's a somewhat controversial reading of the witches. I'm going to read a little bit, and then I'm just going to explain what Terry Eagleton is talking about here. So Terry Eagleton is quite a famous literary critic, very famous literary critic, and he's written some really interesting thoughts about the witches. So he writes this, and he's talking about the witches here. It is they who, by releasing ambitious thoughts in Macbeth, which I think is an interesting idea, the idea that they release already ambitious thoughts in Macbeth rather than sort of put these thoughts into his head. They're kind of already there, latent within Macbeth himself. So by releasing ambitious thoughts in Macbeth, the witches expose a reverence for the hierarchical social order for what it is, as a self-deception of a society based on routine oppression and incessant warfare. Now, if we just unpack that briefly, firstly, they release ambitious thoughts. So Eagleton is asserting there that the ambitious thoughts in Macbeth already exist, and all it takes is, and we'll come to it, what they actually say to Macbeth in a moment, all it takes is effectively one rather vague, ambiguous line for him to go on this sort of streak of bloody murders, obviously starting with the regicidal killing of King Duncan. But also, he says the witches expose the hierarchical social order for what it is, the self-deception of a society based on routine oppression and incessant warfare. This is important, actually. The witches expose and reveal something really monstrous about the society in which King Duncan is ruling, and of course that Macbeth is operating. The play, and this is a bit of a misconception sometimes among students, everything is not fine at the start of the play. Okay, it's not the case that everything is great until that horrible Macbeth turns up and kills poor old King Duncan as he's sleeping. What we've got at the beginning is horrible warfare, violence, as we get that line, what bloody man is this? You know, there's violence, there's deception, there's disorder, there's chaos, there's battle, all these things are going on, and we can see the witches as revealing the true sort of horrors of society, revealing that someone like Macbeth, who is being lauded and celebrated as brave Macbeth, well, he deserves that name, is actually monstrous, is evil, and has these terrible vaulting ambitions to be greater than what he should be. Eagleton continues, the witches are exiles from that violent order. That's important. They're separate. They're outside. Remember that the very opening of the play, the witches are on some blasted heath. They're not part of the society. They're outside. As Eagleton writes, they're inhabiting their own community on its shadowy borderlines and kind of refusing to engage with tribal bickerings and with any sort of military honors. They're separate. They're outside, they are other. And that's an interesting way of thinking about the supernatural in the play more generally. Eagleton continues, it is their riddling, ambiguous speech, and then he uses a quotation in parenthesis, they palter with us in a double sense, which promises to subvert this structure. Their teasing wordplay infiltrates and undermines Macbeth from within, revealing in him a hollowness. Eagleton uses the word lack. So there's lots going on there, but we can think of the supernatural then as, in some ways, and certainly if we're thinking of the supernatural specifically linked to the witches, as as almost having an element of truth, even though we often talk about the witches as being duplicitous and deceitful and deceptive. And there is a sense in which they are that. But through those equivocations, through that ambiguity, through that duplicity, what do? They actually reveal perhaps a deeper truth, which is how violent the society is in which Macbeth and King Duncan is, of course, ruling. And they also reveal the truth about Macbeth, which is actually that he is this, he has this vaulting ambition. They reveal his hamartia and the truth of what Macbeth is deep down. Okay. So an interesting, really, really interesting way of thinking about the witches and obviously linking the witches to the supernatural. Let's go back then with that in mind to what the witches actually say to Macbeth, because sometimes we can forget they don't really say a great deal to him, and they clearly don't need to say a great deal to him to get him to already start thinking about murder. So, first witch says, "All hail Macbeth, hail to thee, Thane of Glamis." The second witch says, "All hail Macbeth, hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor." And then the really crucial third witch says, "All hail Macbeth, that shalt be king hereafter. That shalt be king hereafter." Okay? Essentially, 5 words. They don't give anything more than that. Sometimes, again, we can forget. They don't say anything more than that. That's all it takes. And yet, very shortly after, Macbeth is saying, "Murder yet is but fantastical." Who's mentioned murder? Okay? That is already there within Macbeth. All it takes is a little bit of ambiguity, a little bit of equivocating language that shall be king hereafter. They don't say how that's going to happen. They don't say, "Oh, off you go. Make sure you go and kill King Duncan. Go and have a chat with your wife about it." They don't say anything like that. They just say, "You're going to be king hereafter." Okay? But Macbeth is already caught in that. Remember, the word wrapped is used to describe Macbeth and his kind of reaction to learning that he's now the Thane of Cawdor. Look how our partner is wrapped. He's completely sort of caught and captured in this fantasy of, what is promised to him later on in his life in the future. And that is an interesting way of thinking about it, actually, that Macbeth is always fixated and focused. And again, we can think about the way the sort of supernatural relates to this. Macbeth is always fixated and focused on what is to come, the sort of the next thing. He's always thinking towards the future. And of course, the supernatural links in with that, because it is the witches with their prophetic greetings, their ability seemingly to see into the future, can they? That's an interesting idea, that to push Macbeth in this relentless drive towards the next thing in the future. Okay, he's always sort of fixated on that, these intense sort of fantasies and also fears that he has. Okay. The other thing that we might want to mention here is the use of the word fantastical, meaning, particularly at the time when the play is written, meaning something like produced within or existing within the imagination. But this does raise a more general question, actually, because when Macbeth and Banquo are seeing the witches, there is that question, that sense of, are they actually there? Have we eaten of the insane root, as Banquo says, or are they existing within imagination? And that idea of the fantastical and imagination is also the word that's used when he's thinking about murder as yet fantastical. And therefore, we should be thinking quite deeply about that idea that the witches, their fantastical appearance, the fact that they might just be existing in both his and Banquo's imagination, is also linked to the fantasy of Macbeth engaging in killing, but potentially at this stage, obviously, the thought of killing King Duncan. Now, to continue the line around the witches, we can't really talk about the witches and the supernatural without talking about Lady Macbeth and the link, the very clear link, or links that exist between Lady Macbeth and the witches. So she very famously, in her famous moment on stage where she says, "Come to my woman's breasts and take my milk for gall, you murdering ministers, wherever in your sightless substances you wait on nature's mischief." Okay, so if we think fair is foul, foul is fair, okay, take my milk for gall, so something nutritious and life-giving, and all of those associations of kind of like maternal care and love and compassion is transformed to something bitter, disgusting, gall, okay, substance produced in the gallbladder in the body, which is kind of bitter and unpleasant, okay? So that idea of something sweet turning bitter, fair to foul, is being echoed there. But she's also invoking these murdering ministers, and by that we can probably assume that she's seeking to communicate with evil spirits of some description. These are wherever in your sightless substances. So this is the belief from the time that unless evil spirits took the form of animals in particular, you wouldn't obviously as human beings be able to see them. It's also playing on a rather revolting, strange, horrible image really of the idea at the time that witches would breastfeed these evil spirits when they were in their animal familiar form, and that when they were breastfeeding, it was actually gall that was being consumed, something bitter and disgusting rather than actual breast milk. The final line is one that we can perhaps somewhat overlook. You wait on nature's mischief. So this idea that they're going to be sort of waiting for chaos and disorder, and that then that's when these murdering ministers, these evil spirits, are really going to come into their own. That's one interpretation. However, the other interpretation that's quite interesting is nature's mischief, as in the mischief within the nature of Lady Macbeth and indeed Macbeth himself. That she seems, again, perhaps unwittingly, to be making the point there that an audience, I think, would grasp that these evil spirits, these murdering ministers, are waiting for their opportunity to make mischief with the natures of Lady Macbeth and Macbeth, who don't seem to fully grasp the terrible consequences of invoking these murdering ministers and obviously engaging in regicidal killing. Okay, now we're on to the next big supernatural moment, and this is Macbeth seeing the dagger again. This, maybe it's a fantastical dagger. I'm going to read the little bit of this soliloquy, the most important bit, I think, for the purposes of this episode, and then we can just quickly talk through it. So he says, "Is this a dagger which I see before me, the handle toward my hand? Come, let me clutch thee. I have thee not, and yet I see thee still. Art thou not, fatal vision, sensible to feeling as to sight? Or art thou but a dagger of the mind, a false creation proceeding from the heat oppressed brain? I see thee yet, in form as palpable as this which now I draw. Thou marshalst me the way that I was going, and such an instrument I was to use. Mine eyes are made the fools of the other senses, or else worth all the rest. I see thee still, and on thy blade and dudgeon gouts of blood, which was not so before." Okay, so clearly we've got doubt, we've got uncertainty. Is this dagger actually existing? Is it proceeding from his feverish or heat oppressed, that's a rather poetic way of saying feverish, heat oppressed brain? Is it real? Is it not? This sense of doubt, of uncertainty, of ambiguity is something that is concerning, causing all these questions. And yet, of course, when he says, "Thou marshals me the way that I was going," he was going there anyway, as in going towards killing King Duncan. It's a really, really famous moment, and it is a sign of this kind of doubleness within Macbeth himself. Okay, and that's what the supernatural is really clearly linked to. I like the idea that his senses are beginning to almost sort of pull apart, that they aren't working in unity. That is, his sense of touch is at odds with his sense of sight. He sees the dagger, and yet he can't actually feel the dagger. And there is a sense that he says that mine eyes are made the fools of the other senses. This idea that Macbeth is splitting apart, that his senses aren't forming one unified, neat whole, but actually at odds with one another, that he is splitting apart as a character, is a really interesting way of thinking about it. And of course, we can say that that's one of the impacts of the supernatural within the play. This idea of things slipping through boundaries, that neat expectations are being undermined, that we've got this horrible sense of ambiguity and disorder, is also there in the banquet scene and the return of Banquo. Now, one of the perhaps important ideas here is that often when human beings do something terrible, we may wish to, people will say things like, just put it out of your mind, okay? That we try to sort of suppress those feelings of guilt or of shame or something like that, okay? And psychology tells us generally that whatever you try to suppress or indeed repress, really push deep down inside yourself psychologically, is going to return. And we can think of Banquo's ghost as the return of those repressed feelings of guilt and concern and anxiety. Yeah, that he is quite literally being haunted by the murder of Banquo. But I love this. This, again, something that maybe sometimes we overlook. Macbeth says this. He says, "The time has been that when the brains were out," okay, it's really enjoyably a sort of unpoetic language here. "The time has been that when the brains were out, the man would die, and there an end. As in, normally the expectation is when the brains are out, when someone's been killed in a horrible way, the person's going to be dead, okay? And there an end. But now they rise again. With 20 mortal murders on their crowns and pushes from our stalls, this is more strange than such a murder is. That is, this is stranger and therefore more anxiety-inducing than the murder itself. The return of Banquo's ghost is more horrifying than the murder itself. And this sense of sort of disorder, that the neat boundary between being dead and being alive is again starting to become much more sort of permeable and porous. That used to be the case that when you're dead, when you're alive, but now somehow the dead seem to be rising again, deeply unsettling. This again, the neat divide that we tend to expect is no longer in operation. Should also quickly mention, with 20 mortal murders on their crowns, also who else, a little bit of enjoyable kind of nod there from Shakespeare towards the idea that on his crown, Macbeth also has plenty of mortal murders. After the disaster of the banquet, after this supernatural haunting, okay, the return of Banquo's ghost, the banquet is a total disaster. Should just mention something briefly about the banquet scene. This is really the first big public engagement that Macbeth, and indeed Lady Macbeth, are taking part in. It's an opportunity for Macbeth to demonstrate his power and seem very assured as the new king. And of course, it is absolutely, pathetically disastrous. In the version that we have watched in school from the Globe Theatre, it's almost sort of comically disastrous. I've seen it played much more seriously, but in the version we've seen in school, it's almost funny how badly it goes and how pathetic Macbeth seems, okay? But he resolves after the disaster of the banquet to go back to the witches. He says this: I will tomorrow, and betimes I will to the weird sisters. More shall they speak, for now I am bent to know by the worst means the worst. For mine own good all causes shall give way. I am in blood stepped in so far that, should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as go o'er. So, if we go back to the Weird Sisters, the witches are only referred to once in the play by another character as actual witches. Most of the time, they are referred to as Weird Sisters. And the word weird in English has a very long standing, very interesting etymological history. So, it's linked to the idea of fate, it's linked to the idea of supernatural control and understanding of the future. And so the witches, we can make a very good case for, yes, okay, maybe they are witches, but they're also seemingly closely connected as supernatural elements to the idea of understanding and perceiving the future in a very unsettling and indeed deceptive and duplicitous sort of way. So we just need to make sure we're kind of clear on the etymological history of the word weird. It is worth looking that up and having a really good look at that word, because it does reveal some of the anxieties about these witch-like creatures, if indeed it makes sense to particularly call them witches. Okay, however, it's not the case that supernatural powers and abilities are always within the play. And this is maybe a bit more of a high-end thing to say and to write about. It's not always the case that the supernatural is something that should be feared. It depends what kind of supernatural power we're talking about. So Malcolm, when he's talking about Edward the Confessor, close to the end of the play, he's actually celebrating the supernatural power of Edward the Confessor. Why? Because he's a good king and he's on God's side. So let's have a look, because some of these powers have a very interesting sort of connection to some of the things that the witches get up to. A most miraculous work in this good king, which often, since my here remain in England, I have seen him do. So this is Malcolm speaking about Edward the Confessor, the English king. How he solicits heaven, so that is a supernatural soliciting, we might say. How he solicits heaven himself best knows, but strangely visited people, swollen and ulcerous, pitiful to the eye, the mere despair of surgery. So all these people with these terrible diseases, he cures. So this is the miraculous supernatural power of the King of England, the rightful King of England, Edward the Confessor, to cure the sick. Hanging a golden stamp about their necks, put on with holy prayers, and 'tis spoken, to the succeeding royalty he leaves the healing benediction. That is, he passes on this gift. With this strange virtue, okay, he has another gift, just like the witches actually, but this gift is God-given, not linked to the devil and evil. With this strange virtue, he hath a heavenly gift of prophecy. and sundry blessings hang about his throne that speak him full of grace. So actually here, we've got this strange virtue. He hath a heavenly gift of prophecy. So the play is rather sort of interesting on the question of the supernatural, in that supernatural powers, when they are God given, are good and can be used for good. So not all supernatural powers are necessarily something to be feared. It depends from where those supernatural powers derive. Okay, connected to God, or are they connected to the world of evil and okay, we're on to the final part now, looking at Macbeth when he realizes rather too late the nature of the supernatural in the play, the nature of the witches specifically. But of course, it's too late because very soon after he says the following lines, he's killed and Macduff takes his revenge. So he says this: I begin to doubt the equivocation of the fiend that lies like truth. Now, the word equivocation occurs numerous times throughout the course of Macbeth and is only used on one other occasion in another Shakespeare play. So Shakespeare really wants to draw our attention to the notion of equivocation, that ambiguity in language and the ways in which we can use ambiguity to hide the truth of what we think or what we really feel deep down. He also says of the fiend, so he seems to understand now that actually the witches are on the side of evil. He understands that very clearly. But look at this then, again, fair is foul, foul is fair, that lies like truth. Interesting. We've got lies and truth in the same line there. The idea that lies can be like truth, and therefore perhaps also truth can be like lies. That sense of that slippery kind of ambiguity that we've discussed so many times in this episode is there too. And then we get his final full realization. I think that's the kind of starter. And then the sort of main full realization is when he says, and be these juggling fiends, we've got that word fiend again, no more believed, that palter with us in a double sense. Now, the word juggling is really, really interesting because, of course, when we think of juggling, we think of perhaps someone at a circus or something like that, or a street entertainer. But the word has a very interesting etymology, and it has some meanings which have kind of slipped away. So the word juggler enters English around the 1100s, and it means either like a jester or a buffoon, a kind of comic, clownish character. But also, the word juggler can mean wizard or sorcerer. So it does have actually that supernatural, magical connection to it. By the time Shakespeare is writing Macbeth, the word has this meaning of a sleight of hand, as in the ways in which a magician might perform a magic trick with a sleight of hand, tricks of dexterity, okay, tricks of quick movements. So this is what Macbeth seems to be getting at here. These juggling fiends, the ways in which the witches can have a kind of verbal, linguistic, or language dexterity that they can shift meanings, they can move meanings, they can make something seem real when it's not, in a way that we might associate, I suppose, in 2024 with a magician rather than the notion of a juggler. The word palter also has some interesting meanings. So when it first enters English, it means something like to speak indistinctly, to speak somewhat unclearly. And then later the meaning changes. So again, by the time Shakespeare is writing the play, it means to talk insincerely, to talk in a trifling, even somewhat deceptive way. So this is where he's realized that these fiends are kind of use their supernatural powers, their supernatural abilities, their sleight of hand, their dexterity with language to manipulate him, to trick him, to deceive him. And then we get that really key word right at the end there, double. Palter with us in a double sense. Okay, the word double we know is so important. We know that sense of duality and doubling and duplicity is really, really important in the play. And there we get it, the palter with us in a double sense. And that ultimately is what does for Macbeth. It is that double sense, the ambiguity of the language of the witches, the ambiguity of supernatural signs like particularly the dagger. What does this really mean? It is that very ambiguity that, to go back to what Eagleton says, reveals the truth. Ultimately, it's almost through that deception, through that duplicity, that the truth about Macbeth is fundamentally revealed. And the truth is that this is a hollow man, okay, who deep down has this central lack, this ambition that drives him to do these terrible things. And that's the truth of Macbeth. That's what he is deep down. And it takes paradoxically, strangely, it takes the lies, or it takes the duplicity of the witches and other supernatural elements in the play to actually reveal that fundamental truth. So, loads to be thinking about there, lots to reflect upon. Obviously, you've got your paper one exam on Monday, but hopefully this episode is giving you some more interesting ways, some interesting ideas, some interesting connections, so you can think about the supernatural, the role it plays, the link between the supernatural and the witches, and also the link between the supernatural and these apparitions, whether it's a dagger or indeed something like the ghost of Banquo himself. So, as ever, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and make sure that you listen to any future episodes too.